Somewhere tonight, inside a storage vault at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia, there is a slab of limestone that has not been fully reassembled. It sits in fragments, catalogued as B16676, pieced together as carefully as the 20th century allowed, and it stands, in its reconstructed form, roughly 10 feet tall, 5 feet wide, and 1 foot thick. It was carved 4,000 years ago. It was broken by invaders. It was buried under the courtyard of a ruined city. And it spent at least 2,000 years beneath the soil of what is now southern Iraq before a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley pulled it from the earth in pieces during the excavations at between 1922 and 1934. The stone is a stele, and carved into its surface in low relief across several registers of smooth limestone is one of the most explicit visual records of what a ziggurat was actually for. Not what scholars theorized it was for, not what later traditions claimed, but what the people who built it, who served it, who lived their entire lives in its shadow believed it to be, recorded in stone, in their own hand, in their own time. In the upper registers, a king stands before a seated god. The god's headdress is horned layered enormous, a sign, in Sumerian iconography, of divine rank. The god holds a rod and ring, the ancient Mesopotamian symbol of divine authority, and he extends them toward the king. The king stands at the threshold of something. He is not inside the god's presence. He is not yet admitted. He is receiving, in this carved scene, the specific divine instruction to build the structure that will create the space the god requires. He is being authorized. He is being chosen. And behind him, carved into the stone in neat cuneiform, his name Ur-Nammu, king of Ur-C, 2112 to 2095 BC, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, builder of the great ziggurat that still stands today at Tel al-Muqayyah in southern Iraq, the most intact surviving ziggurat in the world. The question the stele raises is simple, and it is the same question that runs through every cuneiform record we will examine together tonight. If a king, the most powerful figure in Sumerian civilization, had to be explicitly commissioned, specifically authorized, and ritually prepared before he could approach the threshold of the structure he himself had ordered to be built, then who could enter the inner chambers, and who could not? What you are about to hear is not legend. It is not mythology in the dismissive sense of the word. It is an investigation of actual records, clay tablets, administrative lists, legal codes, royal inscriptions, hymns written by a single named human being who lived 4,000 years ago and wrote from inside the spaces most people were never permitted to enter. The answer those records preserve is specific. It is detailed. It is consistent across centuries, across cities, across different gods and different dynasties, and it is stranger and more precise than most accounts of the ancient world are willing to say clearly. Before we go any further, where are you tonight? What city? What room? What hour? Take a moment, if you like, to drop a note in the comments. Not because it matters to the history, but because this history was once told only in certain rooms to certain ears, and tonight it belongs to anyone who is listening. Settle in. Let the weight of 4,000 years rest gently. We begin at the river. Between the rivers, before the records. There is a region of the world where two rivers run roughly parallel toward the sea, close enough that the land between them was, for most of human history, extraordinarily fertile, black soil, regular flooding, the slow annual deposit of mineral rich, silt that made agriculture not merely possible but abundant. The Greeks would later call this region Mesopotamia, from Mesos, meaning middle, and Potamos, meaning river. The Sumerians, who lived there thousands of years before the Greeks gave it that name, called the southern part of their world Kiengi, which translates roughly as the land of the noble lords. They did not think of themselves as living between rivers. They thought of themselves as living at the centre. By around 3500 BC, something unusual was happening in this region. In a landscape where other human communities were organised in small agricultural villages or nomadic bands, a different kind of settlement was emerging along the southern floodplain. These were not just large villages, they were something new in the record of human experience. Cities, places with populations of tens of thousands, places with organised administrations, with divisions of labour so specialised that there were people whose entire life's work was writing down numbers, or fashioning copper tools, or performing the daily rituals of a temple they would never be permitted to fully enter. The earliest of these cities was probably Eridu, located today at the site of Abu Sharain in southern Iraq, approximately 12 miles southwest of the ancient city of Ur. The Sumerians themselves believed Eridu to be the first city on Earth. The Sumerian king list, the most comprehensive surviving record of their political history, inscribed on the four-sided clay prism now held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford under accession number AN 1923-444 and known as the World Blundell Prism, opens with this declaration, rendered in translation after the kingship descended from heaven. The kingship was in Eridu, the city of the god Enki, lord of the underground freshwater ocean. The Sumerians called the Abzu, keeper of the divine Me, the sacred ordinances that governed every aspect of civilization. Eridu was not merely first in political terms, it was first in cosmic terms, the place where the order of the world was first established and maintained. Between approximately 3500 and 2000 BC, a network of city-states grew across southern Mesopotamia, Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, Sippar, Larsa. Each city was organised around a central temple complex. Each temple complex was organised around a structure that rose above the flat alluvial plain like a physical argument against the horizon, a stepped platform of sun-dried brick, tier upon tier, growing narrower toward the summit, with a small temple chamber at its peak. This was the Ziggurat. In Sumerian, the word most commonly used for this structure was Temenguru, which translates as house whose foundation creates aura, or more literally, the house with the terrifying foundation. The Assyrian derivative that gives us our modern word ziggurat comes from the Akkadian zikkuratu, meaning to build on a raised area or height. But the Sumerian name is more revealing. The foundation did not merely elevate the structure, it radiated something. The building itself was understood to be alive with a quality the Sumerians called milam, a divine radiance or terrifying aura that emanated from sacred objects and divine presences. This was not metaphor for them, it was physics. At the Great Ziggurat of Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley beginning in 1922 under joint sponsorship of the British Museum and the Penn Museum, the physical dimensions alone are a statement of intent. The base measures approximately 64 metres in length and 46 metres in width. The original first terrace, which is the only level substantially preserved today, rises approximately 11 metres above the surrounding plain. The structure was originally 3 tiers high, perhaps more, with a summit temple at the top dedicated to Nana, the Sumerian moon god, patron deity of the city of Ur. The exterior walls of the base platform are built in a slight inward batter, not vertical but sloping, a technique that Woolley noted made the structure appear even more massive from the ground, an effect simultaneously architectural and psychological. The core of the ziggurat is solid. There is no internal staircase. There are no hidden passages inside the body of the platform. The structure is not hollow. Access to the upper levels was via 3 external stairways that converged at a monumental gate tower on the northeast face. 1 central staircase perpendicular to the building, 2 flanking staircases running along the sides, all meeting at a single point of entry before the ascent continued. The implication of this design is not subtle. Every approach to the summit passed through one controlled point. There was no other way up. Surrounding the ziggurat at Ur was a complex of buildings collectively known as the Temenos, the sacred precinct, enclosed by a massive mud brick wall. Within this wall were the Nana temple proper, the Ningal temple dedicated to Nana's wife, the Great Gate and Hall of Justice called the Dub Lal Muk, the Treasury building called the Nun Muk, administrative quarters, and crucially for our investigation, a large residential and ritual complex called the Giparu. Woolley described the Giparu as the fortified palace of the high priestess, built southwest of the temple on a spot named Nanna Kazida. It was not simply a house. It was a sealed world inside the already sealed world of the Temenos, a building nearly square in its footprint, measuring 79 metres by 76.5 metres, surrounded by brick walls more than 4.5 metres thick, with a narrow passage running just inside the outer wall, its own internal sanctuaries, lustration tanks, storerooms, a bedchamber, and what Woolley identified as probable subterranean tomb rooms in the eastern corner, where he believed the successive high priestesses of the moon god may have been buried. Who lived in the Giparu? We will examine the records carefully, but for now it is worth pausing on the physical reality of what Woolley uncovered as civilization had built, maintained, rebuilt, modified, and continued to use a complex of this scale and specificity for over 1,000 years. The Giparu at Ur was in continuous use from the reign of Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC to its final destruction sometime in the late 18th century BC when Samsu-Iluna, son of Hammurabi, sacked the city. More than a millennium of unbroken practice. More than 1,000 years of someone, some specific category of person, entering and maintaining the inner rooms while others, by documented law and religious custom, could not. The question the records preserve is not whether access was restricted, it is why. And the answer, when you read it in the tablets themselves, is not quite what you might expect. The Sumerian city was not organised, at its most fundamental level, around commerce or military power, though both were present and important. It was organised around the temple. The temple was understood to be the literal house of the deity, not a symbolic house, not a commemorative monument. The deity was believed to physically reside in the inner sanctum, embodied in or associated with a cult statue housed in a room called the cellar. The god or goddess required the same things a living person required: food prepared daily, clothing changed at festivals, music performed at regular intervals, specific rituals conducted at astronomically determined times. The temple staff existed to provide these services. They were, in the Sumerian framework, the household of the divine. But not everyone could serve in this household, and not all service was equal. There was a gradient of permitted access that moved from the public courtyards, where ordinary citizens could enter to make offerings and observe certain rituals, inward through successive gates and chambers to the cellar itself, where only the most specifically qualified individuals were ever present. This gradient was not invented arbitrarily. It was not the product of priestly ambition or political power consolidation alone, though those forces certainly played their role in how it was maintained. The records suggest that the gradient was believed to reflect a much older structure, a cosmic order that had been established, as the texts repeatedly say, before the current age of the world. Understanding what that meant and where the Sumerians believed that order had come from requires looking at the most fundamental category in their religious and administrative vocabulary, the ME. And the ME, as we will find, changes everything. The language of clay. In the late summer of 1835, a British army officer named Henry Rawlinson was stationed in western Iran as an advisor to the Persian military. He was 35 miles from the city of Kermanshah, where a vast cliff face rises from the plain, a site known locally as Basitun or Behistun. On the face of the cliff, carved at a height of approximately 100 metres and accessible only by rope, was a massive inscription commissioned by the Persian king Darius I around 522 BC. The inscription was trilingual, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. Rawlinson, at considerable personal risk, spent years copying it from scaffolding and rope harnesses. By 1851, he had produced the first reliable decipherment key to the Babylonian script, and with that key, for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, a human being could read what the inhabitants of ancient Mesopotamia had written. What they had written, it turned out, was almost everything. The word cuneiform comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, and forma, meaning shape. The script is named for the wedge-shaped impressions left by a stylus pressed into wet clay. It was not, at its origin, a writing system in the literary sense. The earliest examples, from Uruk circa 3100 BC, are accounting records, lists of commodities, ration allocations, livestock counts. The script developed to meet an administrative need. The temple complexes of early Sumerian cities were managing economic activities of enormous scale, and the human memory could not hold it all. Clay could. A tablet impressed with the right marks, dried in the sun, or fired in a kiln would last indefinitely. And it did. We have, today, approximately 500,000 cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia in collections around the world, representing the administrative, legal, literary, astronomical, medical, and theological knowledge of a civilization that persisted, in one form or another, for 3,000 years. The transition from accounting tablets to literary texts happened gradually. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, around 2600 to 2400 BCE, scribal schools called Eduba, literary tablet house, were producing students trained not merely in arithmetic and accounting, but in the full vocabulary of Sumerian religious and philosophical thought. The Eduba was attached to the temple complex. Its curriculum was controlled by the priestly administration. What was taught, what was written, what was preserved, all of this passed through the filter of an institution that understood itself to be the custodian of knowledge received from the gods, not invented by human minds. This is a distinction the Sumerians themselves made explicitly and repeatedly. In their framework, civilization was not discovered or invented, it was transmitted. The specific word they used for the body of divine knowledge underlying all aspects of civilized life was the ME, and understanding the ME is essential to understanding why certain doors in the Ziggurat remain permanently closed to certain people. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, maintained by the Oriental Institute of the University of Oxford and catalogued as ISAC, contains the most comprehensive searchable collection of Sumerian literary texts in translation. Within this corpus, the text catalogued as ECSL 1.3.1, the narrative poem known as Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the ME, contains what is effectively a partial inventory of the ME. The text survives in multiple tablet copies from Nippur and Ur, dating primarily from the Old Babylonian period, but preserving compositions that scholars such as Samuel Noah Kramer and Kishberg have argued are substantially older, drawing on oral and written traditions going back to the 3rd millennium BC. The narrative of SESL 1.3.1 describes Inanna, goddess of Uruk, travelling by boat to the city of Eridu to visit Enki, the god of wisdom and the keeper of the ME in his Abzu temple, the underground freshwater sanctuary at the heart of the world's first city. Over the course of a banquet at which Enki becomes increasingly generous, he gives Inanna the ME one after another. The text then lists them. Not all of them, the full number was understood to be vast, but enough for us to understand what these things actually were. The ME listed in this text include on ship, the high priestly office, the divine crown, the throne of kingship, descent into the underworld, and ascent from the underworld, the scribal art, the giving of judgment, musical instruments, the arts of the smith, the carpenter, the leather worker, the pure priestly office, the office of the En priest, the office of the Nindingir priestess, the cult prostitute, the hierodule of heaven, the descent of the divine, and many more. What are these things? The mainstream scholarly interpretation, represented by scholars including Thorkild Jacobson in his foundational 1976 work, The Treasures of Darkness, is that the ME are cultural and social institutions the building blocks of civilization, personified or reified in the Sumerian mythological. Imagination as discrete, transferable, cosmic properties. Jacobson argued that the ME represented the Sumerian understanding of how civilization held together each institution, each skill, each social role was underpinned by a divine template that gave it its proper form and function. This interpretation is reasonable and well supported by the texts, but it contains an implication that is rarely examined directly if the ME are cosmic templates for civilizational roles, and if they were understood to be held in specific locations and passed to specific recipients, then the qualifications required to perform those roles were not merely institutional or educational. They were ontological. They were a question of whether a person was, in some deep structural sense, constituted to hold a particular ME. And the records suggest that constitution was understood to be inseparable from lineage. The tablets were not accidentally preserved. They were stored deliberately in the very buildings whose access protocols they describe. When Woolley's excavators found clay tablets in a small compartment off the main courtyard of the Giparu, what the excavation notes describe as room A17, a small space containing contemporary documents, they were finding records stored in the place those records governed. The archive and the threshold were the same location. The text and the restriction it described occupied the same room. The tradition of cuneiform transmission itself was a form of access restriction. The Aduba scribal schools trained their students in increasingly technical Sumerian as the language evolved and, by the early 2nd millennium BC, was no longer spoken in daily life, but survived as a sacred and administrative language, not unlike Latin in medieval Europe. Reading the tablets required training. Having that training required institutional access. Having institutional access required, in almost every documented case, either priestly family membership or royal appointment. The language of the records was itself a locked door, but some tablets were written in a voice that speaks directly from inside that locked space, and none more clearly than those composed by a woman named Enheduanna, whose words have been waiting, buried in the clay of Ur, for 43 centuries. What the King List does not say out loud. In the British town of Oxford, in a low-ceilinged room in the Ashmolean Museum, a clay object approximately 20 centimetres tall sits in a temperature-controlled case. It is roughly square in cross-section, tapering slightly toward the top, inscribed on all four faces in dense columns of cuneiform that together form the most extensive surviving version of what scholars call the Sumerian King List. This is the Weld Blundell prism, donated to the Ashmolean in 1923 under accession number AN 1923.444 after its purchase from a Baghdad dealer by Herbert Weld Blundell. The prism dates to approximately 1827 BC during the period of the Isin dynasty, but the texts it preserves are substantially older, with the underlying traditions traced by scholars including Jacobson and Kramer to the late 3rd millennium BC. The King List opens with a single declarative sentence that in its original Sumerian reads Nam Lugar Tadeaba, translated after the kingship descended from heaven. This is the first thing the Sumerian scribes wanted to say about the history of human governance, not that a strong man gathered followers and declared himself king, not that a wealthy family accumulated power and institutionalized it. The first statement is cosmological. Kingship originated in a non-terrestrial realm and was transferred to earth as a specific act. The text continues, the kingship was in Eridu, the first city. And then the list begins, naming kings who ruled before the Great Flood with reigns measured in units so large, tens of thousands of years, that they are clearly not literal biographical records. They are something else. And what they are, precisely, is one of the most carefully debated questions in Mesopotamian scholarship. The mainstream scholarly consensus, articulated clearly by Jacobson and elaborated by later scholars including Piotr Michalowski and Mark van der Meerup, is that the king list is a political document, a narrative of legitimacy constructed to establish continuity between pre-flood divine kingship and the post-flood human dynasties. The extraordinary reign lengths of the pre-flood kings, Alulim of Eridu, the first named king, is given a reign of 28,800 years. His successor Al-Alyar ruled for 36,000, are understood as a literary convention encoding primordial time, or possibly as sexagesimally calculated spans of astronomical or ritual significance, or as a deliberate exaggeration designed to separate the pre-flood era from the human present by an unbridgeable temporal gulf. The scholarly literature on this question is extensive, and the interpretations are varied. No consensus has fully resolved the problem of the numbers. But what the king list does, structurally and consistently, is something the scholarly debate about numbers sometimes obscures. It divides the world into two fundamentally different categories of person: those in whom Nam Lugal, kingship, the divine institution of governance, resides, and everyone else. This is not a gradation, it is a binary. The text does not say the best man was chosen to be king. It does not describe competition, warfare, election, or inheritance in a modern sense. It says kingship descended. It says it was located. First here, then there, then here again, moved by divine decision, not human political process. After the flood, the king list records a second moment of descent. Nam Lugal Antareyaba, the same phrase repeated, after the kingship descended from heaven again. The flood, in this framework, did not merely destroy cities. It severed the continuity of the divine to human transmission. What came after the flood was a restoration, a re-establishment of the cosmic order that had existed before. And the first city to receive the restored kingship was Kish. The first post-flood king was Jushur, and from that point forward, the list records human dynasties with reign lengths measured in years and decades, not millennia. What this means for the question of Ziggurat access is this: the Sumerian scribes who composed and maintained the king list understood the post-flood world as a period of restoration, not origination. The institutions of civilization, kingship, priesthood, the temple hierarchy, the access protocols of the sacred precinct were not being invented in the cities of Sumer. They were being reconstructed from templates that had existed before. The authority of those institutions, including the authority to determine who entered the inner chambers, derived not from convention or custom, but from a cosmic original that predated the flood. The king list does not explain what the templates contained. It does not describe the specific qualifications for Ziggurat access, but it establishes the framework within which those qualifications made sense, a world in which legitimacy flows downward from a divine source, in which certain human beings are constituted as vessels for specific cosmic functions, and in which the structures of civilization are records of a transmission rather than products of human invention. This is the intellectual atmosphere in which the Emi were understood, in which the En priestesshood operated, and in which the inner rooms of the Ziggurat remained sealed to all but those the records describe as specifically designated to enter them. The king list also does something subtle, which the mainstream reading tends to underemphasize. By listing 8 kings before the flood, all of them in the text's own language, Lugal, Enfords, high priests, or both simultaneously, it preserves the memory of a time when the priestly and kingly functions were undivided. The Sumerian term, and in the king list's earliest sections, refers to a role that was simultaneously civic, sacred, and genealogically transmitted. The En was not merely a religious functionary. The En was the human node in a network connecting the city to the divine order, and the En's authority to access the inner temple was inseparable from that identity. You could not be trained into it. You could not purchase it. You could not conquer it. The texts suggest you had to be born to it and then confirm. How that confirmation worked and what it looked like in practice is preserved in one of the most extraordinary administrative records in the history of archaeology, the ME, powers that could not be inherited, only given. There is a moment in the narrative of ECSL 1.3.1, Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the ME, that is easy to read past, but that contains what may be the most structurally important idea in the entire Sumerian cosmological system. As Enki gives the ME to Inanna, one by one across the banquet table, the text records his words for each transfer, and the word used in the Sumerian for what he is doing is not giving in the ordinary transactional sense. The verb is related to the concept of bestowing upon one who is suited to hold. The implication embedded in the language is that the ME cannot simply be handed to anyone. They can only be transmitted to someone who possesses the requisite nature to carry them without being destroyed or distorted by the encounter. The ME are described throughout the Sumerian textual tradition in terms that blur the line between abstract principle and physical object. In some passages, they behave like tablets or inscribed objects that can be held, stored, transferred, and even stolen. In others, they are more like frequencies, patterns of cosmic order that must be embodied, not merely possessed. The text of Inanna and Enki has Inanna loading them into her boat of heaven, the Ekur, and transporting them by river from Eridu to Uruk, suggesting physical portability. But when they arrive in Uruk, Inanna does not simply distribute them. She establishes the institutions they represent: temples, schools, craft guilds, the hierarchy of the sacred precinct. The full list of ME in the text has been analysed carefully by scholar Bent Auster and earlier by Samuel Noah Kramer in his 1956 work From the Tablets of Sumer, later republished as History Begins at Sumer. Kramer counted approximately 94 ME in the text, though the precise number varies by manuscript and is complicated by the fragmentary state of some tablets. The list includes the roles and institutions directly relevant to temple access, Enship, the high priestly office, the descent to the underworld, which represents both a mythological narrative and a ritual reality, the pure priestly office, the office of the on-priest, and specifically the office of the Nindingir priestess. The term Nindingir, translating roughly as lady who is the god or she who is the god's own. These are not described in the text as skills to be learned or positions to be appointed to through political process. They are ME, cosmic templates, that are transferred with all the weight that concept carries in the Sumerian framework. What does this mean for the inner chambers? Consider what the Sumerians were saying in their own conceptual vocabulary: the role of high priestess, the role of on-priest, the capacity to occupy the innermost sanctuary without being harmed by the melam, the divine radiance that the texts describe as emanating from the cult statue and the sacred objects within the cellar. These were not organisational assignments. They were ontological properties associated with specific cosmic functions. To enter the inner sanctuary without those properties was, in the Sumerian understanding, not merely forbidden by institutional rule. It was dangerous in a structural sense. The space itself was understood to be incompatible with the wrong kind of presence. This is where the bloodline question enters in a way that goes beyond mere aristocratic privilege or political nepotism. The texts consistently describe the qualifications for the innermost roles not as things that can be trained into a person, but as things that must be present from birth, specifically from a lineage that carries the appropriate ME. The king's daughter is made high priestess not because the king wants to consolidate political power, though that consideration was certainly never absent, but because she carries, by virtue of her birth into the royal lineage, the specific ME that qualifies her to be the human vessel for the divine function. This is the logic the texts articulate. Whether we accept it as literal, philosophical, political, or some combination of all three is a question we will return to. For now, it is important to understand it on its own terms. The scholar Thorkild Jacobsen, in The Treasures of Darkness, described the ME as the norms that make each component of the cosmos what it is. This is the mainstream scholarly position. The ME are conceptual templates for cosmic and social order. But Jacobsen also noted something that the popular literature on Mesopotamia rarely reproduces. He observed that the Sumerians appear to have understood these norms as being capable of degradation, of being diluted or corrupted if carried by the wrong vessel. The concern about access to the inner chamber was not merely hierarchical propriety. It was, in the Sumerian framework, a concern about maintaining the integrity of the ME themselves. A person without the appropriate constitution entering the cellar was not merely out of place. They were potentially a source of interference with the cosmic pattern the space was designed to maintain. This framework also explains a feature of the administrative records that is otherwise puzzling: the extraordinary care with which the succession of the priestess was managed, verified, and in some cases, as we will see, fought over and restored through direct political and military intervention. The position was not simply important. It was, in the Sumerian understanding, cosmically load-bearing. Getting it wrong had consequences that extended beyond the temple, beyond the city, into the structure of the world itself. One more dimension of the ME deserves attention here because it surfaces repeatedly in the temple access records. Among the ME listed in ETCSL 1.3.1 are several that relate specifically to the underworld, Arazu, the descent, and the corresponding ascent. The descent of Inanna narrative, which we will examine in detail in a later chapter, preserves a ritual map of what passing through successive inner thresholds actually involved, the progressive stripping away of the ordinary attributes of identity until the traveller arrives at the innermost, point having surrendered everything except the core of what they are. Only someone whose core is, in the Sumerian sense, properly constituted to survive, that stripping can complete the journey and return. The 7 gates of the underworld, with their 7 guardians demanding that Inanna surrender one divine attribute at each threshold, are not merely a compelling narrative. They are a description of what the inner passage of the Ziggurat demanded of those who entered it: a willingness to be entirely known, and a constitution capable of surviving being entirely known. Whether the Sumerians were encoding a literal metaphysical experience, or a ritual initiatory process, or a philosophical proposition about the nature of identity and divine qualification, the answer is probably all 3 simultaneously. That ambiguity is not a failure of the texts, it is their most consistent and deliberate feature. The En and the Giparu, the priestess who lived at the threshold. In the autumn of 1923, Leonard Woolley's excavation team at began clearing rubble from a large mud brick structure southwest of the Ziggurat. They had been working the site for 1 season already, but the scale of what they were uncovering had not yet fully declared itself. As the walls emerged from the desert soil, walls nearly 5 meters thick, enclosing a roughly square footprint of nearly 6,000 square meters, Woolley realized he was inside a structure that was simultaneously a residence, a temple, an administrative complex, and something harder to categorize, a place where the boundary between human habitation and divine service had been deliberately erased. He called it the Giparu. The Sumerian term, written Gipra, means something close to the house of the sacred marriage, or the cloister of the priestess, though the precise etymology is debated. In practical terms, it was the residential and ritual complex of the high priestess of Nanna, the En or Entu, the individual who, among all the hundreds of personnel attached to the Nanna temple complex, was the sole human being understood to stand in direct relationship with the god himself. Woolley found, in the northeastern corner of the Giparu complex, a set of what he identified as probable subterranean tombs, brick-lined chambers accessible through the floors of rooms, in the eastern angle of the building. All of the tombs had been plundered in antiquity, their contents removed. But based on their position within the complex and the dedicatory inscriptions found throughout the structure, inscriptions naming successive priestesses who had held the position, Woolley proposed that these were the burial places of the high priestesses themselves. They lived in the Giparu, they served in the Giparu, they died and were buried in the Giparu. Their entire life, from the moment of their appointment, was contained within a space that was simultaneously a home, a temple, and an archive. The administrative records from the Giparu and the wider earthly temple complex preserve a remarkable continuity of appointment. From the time of Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 BC, to the final destruction of the temple complex by Samsu-iluna around 1740 BC, the position of priestess of Nana at Ur was held exclusively by women of the royal bloodline, almost always the daughter, or occasionally a close female relative, of the reigning king. This is not merely a pattern of political favouritism, it is a consistent, multi-dynasty, cross-cultural practice that persisted through changes of ruling family, conquest, regime change, and imperial transition. Sargon of Akkad, a man of non-Sumerian origin who built the world's first empire by conquering the Sumerian city-states, appointed his daughter to the position. Her name in the role was Enheduanna. The tradition he was following of appointing his daughter as priestess was already ancient when Sargon practiced it, and it continued long after his empire collapsed. This is not the behaviour of a people following a recent political convention. This is the preservation of a protocol understood to be cosmologically necessary. The lustration tanks at the Giparu's main entrance, 3 tanks of baked brick lined with bitumen found by Woolley just inside the northwest doorway, are among the most physically specific details of the access protocol that archaeology has recovered. Before entering the building, a person ritually purified themselves in water. This was not merely symbolic hygiene. In the Sumerian understanding of Kug, Urit/Redikrul, ritual washing was a literal process of realigning the body's condition with the requirements of the space being entered. The farther into the building you intended to go, the more extensive the purification required. The main antechamber of the northwest wing sanctuary, Room A4 in Woolley's excavation numbering, was itself identified as a lustration room. It was lined with brick benches, waterproofed with bitumen, with a floor that sloped to a terracotta drain. You did not simply walk through this room, you prepared yourself in it. Beyond Room A4 was the main courtyard, A16, a gathering place, Woolley wrote, for the select few, the high priestess along with her attendant priests and priestesses, and on occasion the king, who offered sacrifices on behalf of the people as a whole. Note the phrasing, the select few. The king himself was a visitor in this space, present on specific occasions for specific purposes. He was not a permanent resident. Only the high priestess and her immediate attendants occupied this precinct continuously. From the main courtyard, a pair of massive doorways, framed by an elaborate arrangement of niches and buttresses in Woolley's description, led through 2 antechambers to the cellar itself. Room A30, the principal cult room, containing the altar and the niche for the cult statue. The innermost room, A31, was partially within A30 and partially a separate chamber, the space where ultimately the divine presence was understood to be concentrated. Its contents were not recovered intact. The room had been disturbed in antiquity. But the architectural logic is clear and consistent with every other Sumerian temple layout of the period. The innermost room was reached only after passing through the outer wall, the lustration tanks, the antechamber, the forecourt, the main courtyard, the double doorways, the antechamber, cellar, and finally the niche. 7 thresholds. This is not an accident. It is a design. The succession records of the priestesses, known primarily through Woolley's excavation reports and the administrative tablets from the Ur3 period, preserve a list that runs from Enheduanna S. Sik, 2285-2250 BC through more than a dozen named successors, each identified by her appointment inscription and the building activities she undertook within the complex. After Enheduanna came Emenana, daughter of Naram-Sin, then Enetuma, then a gap in the record, then, much later, priestesses appointed during the Isin Lhasa period, one of them named Enenetuma, daughter of Ishme-Dagon of Isin, who rebuilt the Gipparu after it had lain in ruins for half a century, and whose stamped bricks Woolley found throughout the reconstructed building. Even when the city changed hands politically, the tradition persisted. Whoever ruled appointed a daughter to the position. The requirement was not merely blood, it was the specific blood of the ruling house. Whoever the gods currently recognised as holding the Nam Lugal, the kingship descended from heaven. Woolley, in his field notes, did not editorialise about the theological significance of this pattern. He was a meticulous archaeologist with little patience for speculative interpretation. But the pattern he uncovered in the bricks, the tablets, the architecture, and the succession records says something his field notes do not fully articulate. The inner chambers of the Ziggurat complex were not merely controlled by institutional hierarchy, they were controlled by a principle that understood specific lineages as cosmologically qualified, as constitutionally suited, to occupy the threshold between the human world and whatever the Sumerians understood to be on the other side of the innermost door. What that other side was, and what it demanded of the one who stood there, is preserved in a text that was composed by a woman who had stood there herself, Enheduanna, the first named author, and what she recorded. In the collections of the Yale Babylonian Collection at Yale University, and in related tablet copies held at other institutions, there survives the text of a poem composed approximately 4,300 years ago. Its Sumerian title is its opening words, Ninmiara, Lady of all the Me, or, as scholar Sophus Hell translates it in his 2023 edition, Lady Resplendent Me. The author identified herself in the closing lines of the poem with a formula that scholars recognise as the first named attribution of authorship in the recorded history of human literature. She wrote, Enheit Duanazar 3 Mzuskar Mem, Enheduanna, yours are the praises. She was not merely recording a prayer, she was signing it, she was claiming it, she was entering in cuneiform onto a clay tablet that she knew would be archived, the permanent record that these words were hers. Enheduanna was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, founder of the Akkadian Empire, the first empire in recorded history. Around 2285 BC, Sargon appointed her as Priestess of Naneret-Ur and gave her the religious title Enheduanna, which translates roughly as High Priestess, Ornament of Heaven, or more literally, Priestess, Jewel of the Sky. Her personal birth name is not preserved in any surviving record. We know her only by the title she received at the threshold of the Gipparu. In the Sumerian understanding, this may have been entirely appropriate. The role subsumed the person. The Ninmiara, the exaltation of Inanna, is extraordinary in the documentary record for reasons that go beyond its literary quality, though that quality is formidable. It is a poem written from a position of first-person access to experiences that the records make clear very few people ever had. Enheduanna describes, in language that shifts between formal hymn, personal lament, and direct address to the goddess, the moment when she was expelled from her position, driven out of the Gipparu by a rebel named Lugalane during a political upheaval following Sargon's death. And the language she uses to describe the expulsion is revealing. She was removed from the sanctuary. She was made to fly like a swallow from the window. She was placed, she says, in the thorn bush. And the goddess Inanna, she writes, did not look toward her. The divine attention was withdrawn. What is striking about this passage is not the political drama, which is vivid enough. It is the framework of understanding. Enheduanna does not describe her expulsion as a loss of political office. She describes it as a severing of connection with the divine presence she had been qualified to access. The inside of the Gipparu in her account is not primarily an administrative space. It is a relational space, a space where a specific kind of encounter was possible for a person of her specific constitution and impossible for anyone else. Her exile is grievous, not because she has lost status, but because she has lost access to the things she was made to access. The poem proceeds through Enheduanna's attempt to have her case heard. She approaches the moon god Nanna, the patron of whose temple she had served. He does not intercede. She then turns directly to Inanna in a series of invocations that constitute some of the most technically sophisticated religious poetry in the ancient Near Eastern corpus. She catalogues Inanna's powers, specifically her relationship with the Me. You are the Me, the text reads at one point. You carry the Me. The Me are gathered into your hands. She is not merely praising the goddess. She is invoking the specific cosmic principle that she, Enheduanna, as in priestess, was the human vessel for. She is reminding the goddess and the divine order that her role existed because the Me required a human carrier, and that the carrier had to be her. The poem ends with her restoration. Nanna, she records, has presented her case before Nanna's own mother An, the sky god, the highest divine authority, and An grants the restoration. Enheduanna returns to the Gaparu. She performs a specific rite, the upright, a ceremony of ritual confirmation, and the divine attention returns. The connection is restored. The gateway is open again. For our purposes, the most important aspect of this poem is not its narrative arc, but its testimony about what the inner space of the temple complex actually was, as understood from the inside. It was a space of sustained encounter, a space where the boundary between the human and the divine was maintained at its thinnest, where the Me were kept in active relationship with their human carriers, and where the interruption of that relationship was experienced as a genuine ontological rupture, not merely a political setback. The fact that this account was written by the person who had that experience, who had lived inside the Gaparu, who had performed the inner rites, who had been expelled and restored, gives it an evidentiary weight that no external description can match. The Morgan Library in New York holds a tablet inscribed in Sumerian with selected temple hymns from Enheduanna's collection of 42 hymns. The hymn addressed to the Ekinugol, the Great Light, the name of Nanna's temple enclosure at Ur, describes the temple as a place of pure aura, whose interior is terrible in the sacred sense, whose threshold keeps out the uninitiated, and whose inner room is characterized by a quality the text renders as SD, deep, profound, ancient. The temple in this hymn is not a beautiful building. It is a place that has a specific effect on the people who enter it, an effect that is entirely dependent on whether those people are constituted to withstand it. Enheduanna's temple hymn for also contains a phrase that scholars have translated in various ways, but that appears in its most literal rendering to say that the gateway of the inner precinct distinguishes who it sees, meaning that the space itself was understood to be discriminatory in an active sense, not passive, not merely regulated by human gatekeepers, active, as though the sacred space itself participated in the process of selection. This is a claim we cannot verify archaeologically. We cannot excavate a divine quality, but we can note that it is consistent, repeated, and articulated by a person who had direct, lifelong, professionally central access to the space in question. Enheduanna was not theorizing about the inner chambers from the outside, she was reporting from within, and she was not the only one. 7 gates and the architecture of threshold. The narrative poem catalogued in the SCCSL as text 1.41, The Descent of Inanna to the Underworld, is preserved in multiple tablet copies from Nippur and held today in collections at the Penn Museum, the British Museum, and other institutions worldwide. It describes a journey undertaken by the goddess Inanna from the upper world downward through a series of 7 gates into the great below, the realm of the dead, governed by her sister Ereshkigal. At each of the 7 gates, a gatekeeper named Neti demands that Inanna surrender one of her divine attributes before she may pass through. At the first gate, her Shagura crown, the crown of the step, the mark of her divine authority, is removed, At the second gate, the lapis lazuli measuring rod and line, the symbols of her right to judge, are taken. At the third, the small lapis lazuli stones around her neck. At the fourth, the breastplate called Kumemankum. At the fifth, the gold ring on her wrist. At the sixth, the breastplate called Kumemankum, a second garment. At the seventh gate, the pala garment, the royal garment of ladyship itself. She enters the throne room of the underworld, completely stripped of every attribute. She stands before Ereshkigal and the 7 judges of the underworld, naked and bowed low. And then she is killed. The resurrection and return occupy the second half of the narrative. They require intercession, sacrifice, and negotiation. The process is not simple, and it is not painless. But what interests us here is not the resurrection, it is the architecture. The descent through 7 gates corresponds, in a way that Woolley's physical excavation makes concrete, to the actual layout of the inner temple and the Giparu at Ur. Count the thresholds that the archaeological record reveals between the street and the innermost room of the Ningal temple wing of the Giparu, the outer precinct wall, the monumental entrance with its offset lobbies, the first forecourt, the second courtyard with its lustration installations, the doorway to the inner sanctuary wing with its pair of antechambers, and finally the inner sanctum itself, room C27, where the cult statue stood on its brick pedestal and a low podium provided a standing place for the priestess. Not all arrangements produce exactly 7, but the principle of progressive, sequential stripping passage from public to sacred is architecturally identical to the literary structure of the descent. The attribute removed at each gate in the text corresponds, moreover, to a specific class of divine qualification. The crown represents sovereignty, the rod and line represent the right to judge, the jewellery represents connections, social and cosmic bonds, the garments represent the outer presentations of identity, layer by layer, until nothing remains but the essential nature. This is a description not of a prison, but of a test. What is being discovered at the innermost point is whether anything remains when everything removable has been removed. Only someone who has something inalienable, something that cannot be stripped at any gate, survives the passage and returns. In the context of Ziggurat access, this text functions as a description of what the inner passage demanded. It was not merely a question of institutional permission. It was a question of whether, at the innermost threshold, you had something left to stand on, some core identity that the sacred space recognized as legitimate. In the Sumerian framework, that core was what the Emi were, not the garments of role or the symbols of office, but the deep constitutional property that made those garments fitting rather than merely worn. The descent of Inanna is often read as a myth about the seasonal cycle, or as a narrative about the relationship between love and death, or as a cosmological account of the relationship between the upper and lower worlds. All of these readings have scholarly merit, but the text also functions, and this function is rarely emphasized in popular accounts, as an initiatory map. It describes the progressive passage through inner thresholds in terms that exactly mirror the architectural reality of the sacred precinct. It records what is surrendered at each threshold, and what remains after all surrendering is complete, and it is preserved on tablets that were stored in the very buildings whose inner architecture it describes. This correspondence between text and building is not coincidental. The Sumerians were extraordinarily precise record keepers. Their administrative tablets account for the daily bread rations of individual workers, the dates of specific transactions, the names of individual animals in temple herds. They did not preserve imprecision in their records. The correspondence between the 7 gates of the descent and the 7 thresholds of the inner temple complex was, in all probability, deliberate. The narrative was the diagram. The diagram was housed in the building it diagrammed. If you could enter all 7 thresholds, it was because you possessed, as the text describes, the inalienable constitution that survived all stripping. If you could not, if something essential was missing from your nature, the architecture itself, in the Sumerian understanding, would not admit you. Not because a human gatekeeper would stop you, though human gatekeepers certainly existed, but because the space, in their framework, did not recognize you. And what the space required in order to recognize you was precisely what the bloodline was understood to carry, not as privilege, but as qualification. The Gudea cylinders, a builder chosen, not self-appointed. In the ground floor gallery of the Richelieu wing of the Musée du Louvre in Paris, 2 large clay cylinders sit in adjacent cases. They were excavated at the site of ancient Lagash, modern Tel al-Hiba in southern Iraq, by the French archaeologist Ernest de Sarcek, beginning in 1877, and they entered the Louvre collection, where they remain under catalogue numbers AO4151 and AO4153. Each cylinder stands approximately 61 centimetres tall and roughly 32 centimetres in diameter. Together, they contain the longest surviving literary composition in the Sumerian language, a text running to over 1,300 lines, inscribed in some of the most carefully formed cuneiform ever recovered, describing in meticulous detail the divine selection, preparation, construction and dedication of the temple in Ninnu, the White Thunderbird, built by Gudea, ruler of Lagash, around 2125 BC, for the city god Ningirsu. The text begins, as almost all Sumerian foundational narratives begin, with an act of cosmic decision. On the day when in heaven and earth the fates had been decided, Laga raised its head high in grandeur out of all the lands. Gudea receives a dream. In the dream, a figure approaches him, vast, with the crown of a god and the wings of the Anzu bird. At his feet lie the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. On a tablet of lapis lazuli resting on his knee is drawn the plan of a temple. The figure instructs Gudea to build. He wakes. He does not know who the figure is. He does not know what is required. He seeks the interpretation of the dream. The process Gudea then undertakes to determine what the divine instruction means and whether he is genuinely the one being called to carry it out occupies a substantial portion of Cylinder A, and it is this process, more than the construction itself, that illuminates the question of qualified access. Gudea does not simply begin building. He undertakes a series of ritual consultations. He goes to the temple of Nanshe, goddess of dream interpretation. He goes to the temple of Ningirsu directly and performs extended ritual observation. He receives a second, more specific dream in which Ningirsu describes the building he wants constructed. He then undertakes a further period of ritual preparation, purifying the city of Lagash, removing impurity from its streets and households, reorganizing the social order of the city to align with the requirements of the divine commission before a single brick is laid. The text records specific instructions from Ningirsu about who may and may not participate in the construction. Workers must be ritually pure. Certain persons are explicitly excluded. The supervisor, who is angry, Ningirsu instructs, must not approach. One who has not washed his hands must not touch the building material. A person who has spoken a falsehood, whose mouth is full of lies, must not come near the brickwork. These are not arbitrary labour regulations. They are specifications about the kind of human presence that the emerging sacred space will tolerate. And the specifications operate on multiple levels simultaneously: ritual, moral, genealogical, and ontological. Gudea himself is confirmed as the right person for this task through a specific mechanism that appears repeatedly in Sumerian literature about sacred construction, divine recognition. Not merely dream communication, but the moment when the god confirms, through signs and omens that trained interpreters can read, that this specific person, Gudea, ruler of Lagash, of this lineage, at this time, is the one the divine order has designated for this function. The text describes Ningirsu saying to Gudea, in effect, that he has been chosen from among humanity for this task, akin to a fine cow who gave birth to you, a choice cow who knew what was fitting in your heart. The language of birth, of constitutional suitability established at origin is unmistakable. The construction of the Enlil takes years. When it is complete, Ningirsu enters the temple, described in terms that are consistent across Sumerian literature about divine residence. The god is called to come, offered the specifications of the dwelling prepared for him, and then described as accepting residence. At that moment, the Enlil becomes a live sacred space, a location where the Emi associated with Ningirsu are actively present, where the Milam radiates from the inner room, and where the access protocols that Cylinder B describes in terms of festivals and temple service become binding on everyone. In Lugos, for our investigation, Cylinder B is particularly important. It describes, in the section following Ningirsu's entry into the temple, the organisation of the temple's ongoing service, who performs which rituals, who enters which rooms, who approaches the altar and at what times. The language is technical and assumes familiarity with the institutional hierarchy, but the underlying structure is consistent with every other Sumerian temple record. Access diminishes as you move inward, and the qualification required for the innermost service is not described as learnt skill, but as inherent suitability confirmed by divine selection. Gudia's cylinders were composed in a city that was contemporary with the third dynasty of Ur, a period when the institutional framework for temple access had reached a high degree of formalization. They are important not because they reveal something unique about Lagash, but because they show that the same framework, the same understanding of divine selection, ritual preparation, bloodline suitability, and cosmically graded access was operative across independent Sumerian city-states simultaneously. Lagash and Ur shared no political authority in this period. Gudea and Ur-Nammu were contemporaries, but they were rulers of separate cities, yet the pattern is identical: divine commission, bloodline confirmation, ritual preparation, and the establishment of inner precincts accessible only to those the divine order had designated. The Gudia cylinders are also significant for something they do not do, which every other grand building narrative in human history almost invariably does. They do not celebrate the builder's ambition. Gudea is not glorified for his vision or his leadership or his wealth. He is honoured in the text for his receptivity, for his willingness to listen, to seek confirmation, to submit to the divine specification rather than imposing his own. The temple is not his achievement, it is his act of transmission. He built what the god described. He qualified the workers as the god instructed. He prepared the city as the divine order required. And when it was done, he stepped back. The Enlil was not Gudea's house, it was Ningirsu's. And Gudea's primary achievement was correctly determining that he, rather than any other ruler in his time, was the designated vessel for the work. This is the model that the Sumerian records preserve consistently across multiple centuries, cities, and political contexts. The inner space is not created by human ambition. It is established by divine selection. And the people permitted to enter it are the ones that selection specifies. Not the most powerful, not the most educated, not the most devout in a general sense. The ones the Emi recognised. The code that protected the threshold. In the collections of the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, held under catalogue number IM55357, is a clay tablet from the Ur-3 period containing what scholars have identified as the oldest surviving law code in the world. A second and more complete copy is held at the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. The code is attributed to Ur-Nammu, the same king depicted on the stele we examined at the opening of this investigation, the same king whose commission to build the Great Ziggurat is recorded in both the archaeological and textual record. The code of Ur-Nammu dates to approximately 2100 to 2050 BC and is written in Sumerian. It predates the more famous code of Hammurabi by more than 3 centuries. The code is primarily concerned with civil and criminal law, penalties for assault, standards for weights and measures, protections for widows and orphans, provisions for false accusations, agricultural regulations, Scholars including Martha Roth, whose 1997 work Law Collections from Mesopotamia and Asia Minor provides the most comprehensive scholarly edition, have noted that the Code of Urnamu reflects a society of considerable legal sophistication, one in which the rights of individuals, including those of lower social status, were encoded and protected rather than left entirely to the discretion of the powerful. Within the code, and in related Ur-3 administrative texts from the Nana temple complex at Ur, there are provisions that directly address the question of temple access and personnel qualifications. These provisions are not always dramatic in their language, administrative cuneiform rarely is, but their implications are substantial. They establish, in legal language, the principle that access to sacred space is a matter of cosmic order that the state has an obligation to enforce. The king is not merely a patron of the temple, he is the guarantor of the cosmic protocol that the temple embodies. Urnamu's prologue to the code, the literary framing that precedes the specific laws, establishes the theological basis for his legal authority. Nana, the moon god, has chosen Urnamu to be his earthly representative. The authority to make law derives from this divine selection. And the first act of governance that the prologue describes, even before the legal provisions, is Urnamu's commission to build Nana's Ziggurat. The connection is not incidental. The legal order and the temple order are the same order, expressed in different registers. The law that protects ordinary people from false accusation and the architecture that protects the inner chamber from unauthorized entry are both expressions of the same cosmological principle, that things must be in their proper relation. The Ur-3 administrative tablets from the Nana temple, held in various collections and studied extensively by scholars including Niek Veldhuis and Piotr Steinkeller, contain detailed records of temple personnel. These records list, by name and title, the categories of person who performed specific functions within the complex. The hierarchy is elaborate: Abrabub, Sangha, Cheat, of a specific cult function, Gar-lamentation priests, who performed the Arema and Balag lament compositions, Nar, Munastur, young women in Tempui, and many more. Each category has a specific spatial domain within the temple complex. The records make clear that movement between these domains, specifically movement from outer to inner space, was not a matter of individual initiative or seniority. It was governed by specific qualifications attached to specific roles, and those roles were occupied by specific categories of person. The Gala priests offer a particularly instructive example. They were permitted access to the outer courts and the areas where public ritual was performed. They were essential personnel in the performance of the lament liturgies that were a central feature of Sumerian temple religion. But their access records do not extend to the inner sanctum. There is no administrative tablet placing a gala in the cellar. This is not because they were unimportant. They were among the most prominent and respected figures in Sumerian religious life. It is because their role and the emi associated with it was oriented toward the outer face of the divine, toward the communal, the public, the ritualized expression of cosmic grief and renewal. The inner chamber required a different orientation, a different constitutional suitability. The impriestess appears in the administrative records as a category unto herself. She is not listed among the temple personnel in the way that other roles are catalogued. She is not an employee of the temple. She is the temple's living axis. Her administrative designation in the records is simply N, High Priestess, and her qualification is never described in the administrative texts as having been earned or trained for. It is always assumed because it derives from her birth into the royal bloodline combined with divine confirmation. The process of confirmation involved, as far as the records allow us to reconstruct it, omen reading, ritual observation, and a formal ceremony of investiture that the administrative tablets record as having been conducted in the presence of the king and the senior temple personnel. The legal protection of this system is implicit in the code and explicit in the administrative sanctions. Violations of temple access protocols, unauthorized entry into restricted precincts, misuse of sacred objects, performance of rites without proper qualification were treated not as civil infractions, but as religious crimes of a category that threatened the cosmic order directly. The relevant Sumerian term is an Tagol, a state of being that is roughly translatable as abomination before heaven, a condition in which an act has disrupted the proper relation between the human world and the divine order. The remedy for an Tagol was not simply punishment of the individual. It was a series of purification rituals designed to repair the cosmic disruption the violation had caused. This framing violation as cosmic damage rather than merely social transgression is consistent with everything the ME framework tells us about how the Sumerians understood the inner chambers. The restriction was not arbitrary authority. It was not merely institutional control. It was, in their understanding, a structural necessity, the preservation of the space where the ME were maintained in active relationship with their human carriers, and where the cosmic order that the ME embodied was continuously renewed. The king who built the Ziggurat, the priestess who inhabited its inner precinct, the scribes who recorded the administrative protocols, the legal code that enforced them. All of these converge on the same answer to the question the stele on the wall of the Penn Museum asks silently. You could enter the inner chambers if, and only if, the divine order had placed in you the specific ME that the space required. The records do not argue this. They assume it. It is the air they breathe. The Atrahasis parallel before the flood who served, held in the British Museum under catalogue number BM78941 and in related fragments distributed across other collections, is a clay tablet, or more precisely a set of tablets, inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform and dating to approximately 1700 BC during the Old Babylonian period. This is the Atrahasis epic, the most complete surviving Akkadian flood narrative, which tells the story of human origins, the divine decision to create humanity, a series of divine attempts to reduce the human population, and finally the great flood survived by the wise man Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, and his household. The Atrahasis epic is primarily an Akkadian composition, but it draws extensively on Sumerian antecedents. The flood narrative it contains is closely related to the Sumerian flood story preserved on a fragmentary tablet in the Penn Museum, CBS 1673, the same tablet catalogue number associated with the Penn's flood narrative fragment, whose Sumerian hero is Ziusudra, the life of long days, the figure, who becomes Atrahasis in the Akkadian tradition and Noah in the biblical. The scholarly consensus, established through careful comparison by Wilfred Lambert and Alan Millard in their 1969 critical edition, Atrahasis, The Babylonian Story of the Flood, is that the Akkadian epic is an elaborated version of older Sumerian traditions, preserving the theological framework of the Sumerian original within a new linguistic and cultural context. For our purposes, the most important section of the Atrahasis epic is not the flood narrative itself, but the creation section, the opening passages that explain why humans were made. The text records that before humans existed, the lesser gods, the Igigi, were performing the labour of the universe, digging the great canals, carrying the soil, maintaining the cosmic systems that kept the world functioning. After long ages, the Igigi rebelled. They burned their tools and refused to continue. The senior gods, the Anunnaki, including Enlil, Enki, and the mother goddess Mami, convened to resolve the crisis. Enki proposed the solution: create a being from clay mixed with divine substance to perform the work the Igigi could no longer bear. The being that was created was humanity, and the work humanity was created to perform was the Dulu-il, the service of the gods. The Sumerian word for this service is dutu, and it encompasses a specific set of practices: the preparation of divine food and drink, the maintenance of the god's dwelling, the performance of the ritual calendar, and the preservation of the ME in active expression. This was not employment. It was the fundamental reason for human existence in the Sumerian framework. The human being was a vessel designed to carry the divine service forward in time. But the Atrahasis narrative also preserves something that the popular summary of humans created to serve the gods frequently omits. The service was not universal in its inner form. All humans served the divine order in a general sense, through agriculture, through craft, through social order, through maintaining the conditions that the temples required. But the direct service of the divine presence, the inner service, the maintenance of the ME in their most concentrated form, the occupation of the threshold between the human and divine worlds, was reserved for those who carried a specific quality that the text associates with the pre-flood: transmission of knowledge. Atrahasis himself is characterized in the epic as Mick, exceedingly wise, not wise in a general way, but specifically in possession of a quality that makes him recognizable to Enki as the appropriate vessel for divine communication. When Enki warns him of the coming flood, he does so not through general broadcast, but through a specific channel. He speaks to the wall of Atrahasis' house, in effect speaking to the built environment of the person rather than directly to the person, a gesture that in Sumerian theological terms implies that the very dwelling of Atrahasis partakes of the quality that makes him receivable. Atrahasis survives not because he is powerful or because he happens to be in the right place. He survives because the divine order recognizes in his specific constitution the appropriate carrier of what must be preserved through the flood. What must be preserved through the flood in the framework of the Sumerian and Akkadian narratives is not merely biological continuity. It is the transmission of the ME, the divine ordinances that constitute civilization. The flood, in this framework, is a reset, a moment when the structures of the world are cleared away and must be rebuilt. And they must be rebuilt correctly, not invented from scratch by human ingenuity, but reconstructed from the templates that the survivors of the flood carry. This is why the post-flood king list repeats the phrase after the kingship descended from heaven, because the descent had to happen again. The transmission had to be re-established. The cosmic order had to find new human vessels. The implication for the question of bloodline access to the Ziggurat's inner chambers is this: if the post-flood institutions of Sumerian civilization were understood as restorations of pre-flood arrangements, and if the access protocols of the inner temple were understood as part of that restoration, then the bloodline requirements for inner access were not invented by the Sumerian city-states. They were inherited from a tradition that preceded the flood, a tradition that the survivors and the lineages descended from them were charged with preserving intact. The inner chambers were not simply the holiest rooms in the building. They were, in the Sumerian understanding, the physical locations where the ME were maintained in their most concentrated and undiluted form, a continuity that stretched back, in principle, to the world before the flood, before the reset, before the moment when the transmission had to be re-established. This reading is speculative, necessarily so, because the texts do not make this connection explicitly. What they do is establish, separately and consistently, two things: that the post-flood world was understood as a restoration of a pre-flood order, and that inner temple access was governed by principles of divine designation and constitutional suitability rather than institutional convention alone. The connection between these two things is an inference, not a statement, but it is an inference the texts themselves seem to encourage, and it is consistent with the philosophical framework that appears in every category of Sumerian record we have examined. The world is a transmission. The inner chambers are where the transmission is maintained, and the people who enter them are the ones who carry what the transmission requires: patterns across the cities, Eridu, Nippur, Uruk. The practice of restricting inner temple access to specifically qualified lineages was not unique to Ur. The Ur evidence is the most fully excavated and the most extensively documented, in part because Woolley's multi-season excavation was extraordinarily thorough and well published, and in part because the Giparu's physical preservation was unusually complete. But the same pattern, divine designation of the ruling bloodline as qualified for inner temple service, architectural gradation of access from public to innermost, administrative documentation of the restriction, appears across the major sacred cities of Sumerian civilization, each city articulating the principle through its own patron deity, its own architectural form, and its own administrative tradition. At Nippur, excavated by University of Pennsylvania teams beginning in 1889, under the direction of John Peters and Hermann Hilprecht, in a series of campaigns that produced tens of thousands of tablets, the central sacred precinct was organised around the Ekur, house mountain, the temple of Enlil, king of the gods and lord of the cosmic wind. The Ekur was not merely a local temple. In Sumerian theological geography, it was the centre of the earth, the point where the axis of cosmic order was most directly expressed. The Nippur tablets, distributed today across the Penn Museum, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and other collections, contain an extraordinary range of administrative, literary, and religious texts documenting the organisation of the Ekur's service. The temple hymns, composed by Enheduanna, include a hymn addressed to the Ekur at Nippur, the sixth of her 42 hymns in the Morgan Library tablet, which describes the temple in terms that are strikingly similar to her descriptions of the Nana complex at Ur. The Ekur is described as having an inside that is pure, a threshold that keeps away the evil, and an inner precinct whose occupants are specifically identified by their divine appointment rather than their human qualifications. The hymn describes Enlil as having chosen the personnel of his inner sanctuary from among the children of the ruling lineage, the same pattern documented at Ur, applied now to the temple of the supreme god, at the city understood to be the cosmological centre of the world. At Uruk, the temple complex of Inanna, the Iana, House of Heaven, represents one of the earliest and most archaeologically documented sacred precincts in Mesopotamia. The Uruk vase, now in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, but recovered from Uruk by German excavations in 1912, shows in its upper register a procession of figures bringing offerings to a temple, with the largest human figure identified as the En of Uruk, likely a priest-king standing at the threshold of the inner precinct in a posture that has been analysed by scholars, including Hans Nissen and Irene Winter, as representing the formal crossing of the boundary between the outer and inner world. The figure is not inside yet, he is at the threshold, the moment of crossing, of passing from the world where multiple people stand to the world where only one may stand, is captured precisely, and it is the central visual statement of the artefact. The Uruk administrative tablets from the late 4th millennium BC, the earliest administrative documents in human history, record the management of the Anna complex in categories that already distinguish between outer and inner service. The personnel lists, though their Sumerian terminology is not always fully deciphered at this early period, clearly differentiate between categories of worker whose domain is the outer precinct and categories whose activities are recorded in connection with the innermost sanctuary. Even at the very dawn of writing, the distinction was being maintained and recorded. At Eridu, where excavation was conducted by Fuad Safar and Muhammad Ali Mustafa for the Iraqi State Organization of Antiquities and Heritage in the 1940s, the archaeological sequence reveals something remarkable. Beneath the Ur-3 level temple at the site, excavation uncovered 17 successive temple levels, 17 rebuildings of the same structure on the same spot, beginning from the earliest prehistoric period and continuing through the Sumerian era. Each rebuilding respected and built over the foundations of its predecessor. At the very base of the sequence was a small room with an altar, a fish offering deposit, and material dated to approximately 5000 BC, long before writing, long before the institutional temple hierarchy, long before the administrative records we have been examined. The priestly service at Eridu, in this excavation's testimony, predates writing by 2000 years. Whatever protocol governed access to the innermost room at prehistoric Eridu, it was established and maintained without documentation, maintained by implication through the one mechanism that requires no writing, lineage, what you were born knowing how to do, and where you were born qualified to stand. The consistency across Eridu, Nippur, Uruk and Ur, 4 cities, 4 patron deities, 4 separate political histories, cannot be explained as the influence of a single tradition from a single source. The earliest layers predate the intercity communication that would have carried institutional influence. The pattern appears to be foundational, not transmitted from city to city through cultural contact. The Sumerians encountered this principle in some form at the beginning of what we can reconstruct of their civilization, and they maintained it in consistent form for thousands of years. What changed over time was not the principle, but the administrative apparatus for enforcing it. The earliest temples had no written records. By the Ur III period, the restriction was encoded in law, documented in administrative tablets, architecturally expressed in lustration tanks and successive gated thresholds, and preserved in literary texts that described its cosmological basis in explicit terms. The outer form elaborated, the inner principle did not. 3 ways of reading what the tablets say. At this point in our investigation, we have accumulated a body of evidence from multiple independent sources: archaeological, administrative, legal, literary, and architectural, that all point toward the same conclusion: the inner chambers of the Sumerian Ziggurat were restricted to those the divine order had designated, and that designation was inseparable from lineage in a way that the texts describe as cosmologically rather than merely politically grounded. The evidence is real, the pattern is consistent. The question of what to make of it, however, is genuinely open. And intellectual honesty requires that we present the 3 principal interpretive frameworks fairly, including the strongest objections to each. The first reading is the symbolic and metaphorical interpretation, the mainstream scholarly position as represented by figures including Thorkild Jacobson, Samuel Noah Kramer, and more recent scholars including Jeremy Black and Anthony Green. In this reading, the language of divine designation, the ME, the bloodline qualifications, and the cosmological framing of temple access are all expressions of a symbolic system that served social and political functions. The royal family's claim to manage the inner temple was a political strategy. By asserting that only the king's daughter could occupy the innermost precinct, the ruling dynasty consolidated religious authority alongside political authority, preventing the emergence of an independent priestly class. That might challenge royal power. The narratives about divine selection, the ME as cosmic properties, the pre-flood transmission of knowledge, all of these were, in this reading, ideological constructions. They were the language in which political reality was expressed in a culture that did not separate the sacred from the secular. This interpretation has substantial merit. There is clear evidence that the institution of the royal priestesshood served political functions. Sargon's appointment of Enheduanna was a political act, designed to tie the religious authority of Ur to the legitimacy of his new empire. The persistence of the tradition through regime changes can be explained as practical political accommodation, each new ruler appropriating the existing religious authority structure rather than dismantling it. The extraordinary care with which succession was managed can be read as institutional self-preservation rather than cosmic necessity. The strongest objection to the purely symbolic reading is that it requires us to bracket the text's own explicit statements about what they are describing. The texts do not say the king's daughter occupies the inner precinct in order to consolidate political authority. They say the king's daughter carries the ME appropriate to this function. When Enheduanna describes her exile as a severing of cosmic connection rather than a loss of political office, the symbolist reading requires that she was either performing a political narrative or that she was genuinely deceived by her own ideology. Neither of these is impossible. Both are, at a minimum, somewhat condescending to a person of demonstrated extraordinary intelligence. The second reading is the encoded wisdom interpretation, the position that the bloodline requirements and the cosmological language encode philosophical and spiritual truths about the relationship between identity, qualification, and sacred service, without being literal accounts of either biology or cosmology. In this reading, the insistence on royal bloodline is a vehicle for a deeper principle, that the capacity to sustain the inner sacred space is a real human capacity not available to everyone, that develops through generations of preparation, discipline, and spiritual inheritance. The blood is not merely genetic, it is the accumulated pattern of a lineage that has maintained a specific relationship with the divine, through practice, through teaching, through the lived reality of generation after generation occupying the threshold. The ME are not cosmic objects, but wisdom traditions. The divine designation is not supernatural selection, but the recognition of a quality that genuine cultivation produces. This reading has the advantage of taking the text seriously without requiring literal acceptance of their cosmological claims. It is consistent with how philosophical and spiritual traditions in many cultures have used the language of descent and lineage to describe the transmission of experiential wisdom. The difficulty with it is that it requires the texts to mean something different from what they say. The Sumerian scribes were precise people. When they distinguished between the ME as cosmic templates and human skill as learned ability, they were making a distinction they considered important. The encoded wisdom reading tends to collapse that distinction in ways that may be interpretively convenient, but are not quite what the texts describe. The third reading is the historical documentation interpretation, the most literal and the most heterodox, in the sense that it takes the texts at face value as records of what the Sumerians believed they were experiencing, rather than as symbolic or philosophical constructions. In this reading, the bloodline qualifications for inner temple access reflect a real phenomenon, the preservation, through genealogical transmission, of some specific quality or capacity that made certain individuals genuinely capable of sustaining direct encounter with what the Sumerians called the divine presence. The ME are real properties. The pre-flood transmission is a real history. The cosmic designation of specific lineages for specific functions is a real event in the Sumerian understanding of how their civilization came to be. This reading does not require us to accept any specific theory of what the divine presence actually was. It requires only that we take the Sumerians seriously as observers of their own experience, that when they say the inner chamber has a quality that distinguishes who it admits, they are describing something they genuinely experienced, not a political fiction they invented. The difficulty with this reading is that it cannot be verified archaeologically. We cannot excavate the divine radiance. We cannot recover the constitution of the priestess from her bones. We are entirely dependent on the texts, and texts can describe experiences that are not literally real. The most honest position is this: the evidence we have examined does not resolve between these three readings. It is consistent with all three and inconsistent with none. What it does establish, beyond any serious doubt, is that the restriction itself was real, that it was consistently maintained across centuries and cities, that it was understood by the people practicing it as cosmologically necessary rather than merely institutionally convenient, and that the specific mechanism, bloodline, was not the whole of the qualification, but the starting point from which the qualification was confirmed. What those things mean about the nature of human experience, the nature of sacred space, and the nature of whatever it was the Sumerians were maintaining in their innermost rooms, that question the tablets do not answer. They preserve it, intact, in clay, for us to carry, what the dust still holds. There is a room in Philadelphia, a storage vault, temperature controlled, illuminated by low and careful light. In it, a limestone stele stands in fragments, pieced together as completely as the 20th century could manage. The king on the stone holds his tools. The god extends the rod and ring. The threshold between them, between the one who was chosen and the one who does the choosing is where this entire investigation began. 4,000 years have passed since a mason cut that image into limestone. Cities have risen and been buried. Languages have died without descendants. Empires whose names we know only from their own records have come and gone. And yet the stele was there underneath the soil of Iraq, and Woolley's team found it, and it was brought to Philadelphia, and it sits in a vault, and the threshold it depicts is still there, in the stone, unchanged. The records say that certain bloodlines were permitted to enter the innermost chambers. They say this in legal codes, in administrative lists, in temple hymns, in architectural plans expressed in fired brick and bitumen, and in a poem written by a woman who had been thrown out of the inner room and then restored to it, and who spent her life writing from inside a space that almost no one else could enter. The records are consistent. They span centuries. They come from independent cities governed by different dynasties and worshipping different patron gods. And they all say the same thing. The threshold recognizes who may cross it. And what it recognizes is not ambition or learning or political power. It is something the texts call the ME, something constitutionally present in those who are designated and absent in those who are not. Whether the ME were cosmic properties in a literal sense, whether the divine selection of bloodlines reflected a real transmission of something that human experience can register but science cannot yet measure, whether the Sumerians were preserving a genuine memory of a time when the boundaries between the human and the divine were organized differently. These questions remain open. The tablets do not close them. They hold them with the same patient care with which the clay held the cuneiform for 4,000 years, not answering, not denying, simply preserving. What you have heard tonight is not a conclusion. It is an accumulation of evidence, laid down carefully, the way sediment layers at the bottom of a river, slowly, consistently, over a long time, until the pattern is visible to anyone willing to look. The pattern says that the inner chambers were real, that the restrictions were real, that the qualifications were real, and that the cosmological framework which generated those qualifications was, for the people who lived inside it, as real and as verifiable as the walls of baked brick that surrounded their lives. What the framework describes about the nature of the world, about whether lineage carries something that pure training cannot produce, about whether certain spaces respond to certain presences and not to others, about whether the universe has a structure that selects in some meaningful sense. Who stands at its most sensitive thresholds? These are questions you are now equipped to consider, not because this investigation has given you the answer, but because you have spent the last few hours in genuine contact with what the Sumerians recorded, and genuine contact with an ancient mind that thought carefully about these things is, perhaps, the closest any of us will get to standing at the threshold. The dust of still holds the marks of the bricks Namu laid. The cuneiform still holds the marks of the stylus that Enheduanna pressed into the clay. The question still holds the shape of the thing it asks. And tonight, wherever you are, you have held it too. Let it rest with you, quietly, the way a river rests between its banks, holding everything, releasing nothing, moving at a depth that only the patient can feel. The tablets have kept their silence for 4,000 years. They can afford to wait a little longer. Sleep well.